And everybody, I suppose.
I'd like to introduce you people to a good friend of mine. First met him up in North Bay, Ontario, in the Pierre Fournier trial. And Tony was an expert witness for the Crown on Indigenous rights. And he was on the stand. He took the stand for 22 days. 22 days. And he came over a lot of our local history. And some of the things that he talked about really kind of shocked me because, you know, where does this white guy get his information? A lot of our own people don't know. So he kind of surprised me there. But anyway, I'll let Tony, he's going to talk about the Haldeman. And so, Mr. Tony Hall, thank you.
Well, I've been speaking here in prior times, but I've never seen an event this wonderful, this much community spirit, this much life, ages, young to old. I want to say thank you, Miigwech, for manifesting the good-hearted spirit I see here. And we're living in very dangerous times, and it's said that it's much more dangerous now than during the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was a kind of regulated thing because the superpower rivalry between the Soviet Union and the United States, we don't have anything that clear anymore. It's kind of rock and roll. It's kind of law of the jungle. And they're bringing missiles right in next to Russia and trying to provoke Putin. We live in a time of unrestrained militarism. You might notice there's no coherent peace movement right now. And I look at myself as a peace activist, as a lover of my fellow human beings, as a voice against genocide, the ongoing genocide that Indigenous peoples experience and continue to experience to this day, which began in 1492. And this type of history, to articulate this kind of history these days is dangerous. And it may be known to some of you that I am a full tenured professor who one day was suspended without pay, put out of the classroom, and I can't enter my own campus. I've been criminalized, and I'll tell you that yes, Larry Salt points to the oppression of knowledge, and we're all PhDs and sovereign individuals. But there are times when book learning and the kind of knowledge that is disseminated and developed within universities has a role. Like it did when I was on the stand in North Bay, Ontario, and lo and behold, Bill Squires, we become friends. And I start to see the depth of this man's positions, and I start to become aware of the picture of his father in San Francisco in 1945, showing the Haldeman, because the Haldeman is part of our international inheritance as human beings. It's not a local matter. This is an international matter. And speaking of international matters, Bill Squire took from his pocket Deskah's passport, Levi General's passport. And you know, he was at the League of Nations when the government of Canada was cracking down and trying to violate the covenant chain heritage, the internationalization of this government, which was never subjected to the Indian Act until 1923, when the Mohawk workers, who were having lacrosse games to sponsor Diskahat in Europe, when the new Northwest Mounted Police for the first time infiltrated a group, the Mohawk workers, so that they could undermine Deskah's role, taking these issues international. And remember, I'm just going now to that moment when Bill Squire pulls out Deskah's passport, and I see a stamp of the United States, and I see a stamp of France, and all of this is evidence that these governments recognized the international status. I know we're in very fraught language. Do I say the League of Haudenosaunee? Right here, we are celebrating, we are recognizing the Haldeman Tract and a certain heritage of history that makes the Mohawks, specifically the Mohawks, the particularly close allies of the British imperial government. And so this is history. When we say the Haldeman Tract, the Haldeman Deed, I did my PhD thesis in Indian policy in Upper Canada. And allow me to take perhaps 4 minutes to just say my understanding of what the Haldeman, do we call it a deed? Do we call it a proclamation? Do we call it, we call it a tract? It's the Haldeman Tract Recognition Lunch that we're at. The Haldeman, what led up to the Haldeman? Well, there was the British Empire. There was a conquest by the British imperial government of the French people, of the people of Canada. Canada was Aboriginal, Roman Catholic, French-speaking. That was the society of Canada, and Canada was sometimes referred to as New France. And its territories were immense, but the basis of that territorial claim of France was friendly relations with many indigenous peoples. Coureurs de bois who could go through the territory, who learned Aboriginal languages, who learned to operate according to respect for First Nations principles. Sometimes they took wives, they had children, they become what known as a Métis, I guess arrived like 9 months after Columbus or something. But this Métis identity, this métissage, the Canadien, the Aboriginal, Roman Catholic, French identity, and then along comes, the British. And the British, after the French they withdrew. And how is Britain going to govern this huge territory inhabited primarily by native people? When I say the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which refers to this vast lands reserved to the Indians as their hunting grounds. This is very important history. And there was a procedure. The British imperial government said, we're not just going to go and higgledy-piggledy conquer and do genocide. We're going to have an orderly expansion westward. And if at any time any of the said Indians should be inclined to dispose of the said lands, the same shall be purchased for us at some public meeting. This is the origins of what become the treaty system, which is to this day being applied in British Columbia, where they didn't make treaties. But the first treaty was the treaty at Fort Stanwix, which was classic Sir William Johnson working with Joseph Brant, and the borders were adjusted. The border was adjusted to the Ohio River. And there was a kind of understanding that, saying a watershed, that the lands, you can't go beyond this sort of artificial line that nobody really knows where it is. But you'd put it at a river, that makes sense. And the idea was, north of that river, that's our territory. Treaty of Fort Stanwix, 1768. And from 1768 to the end of the War of 1812, when Tecumseh, took up arms to defend this territory north of the Ohio River, this was a great controversy. What about this land north of the Ohio River? And then, of course, there was a rebellion, a secessionist movement within British Empire, within British North America. And the people pushing this agenda of westward expansion, kind of land speculators on steroids, kind of like George Washington and Benjamin Franklin. These are first and foremost land speculators. And lo and behold, these secessionists were able to get the support of France, the French monarchy, ironically, and took up arms and actually were successful in their response to the Royal Proclamation, which says you can't go westward and develop these lands until the Indians consent. And they said, what up with that? It's our manifest destiny to go west. And so they succeeded. A place called the United States of America was created. And that is global history. No person on earth is unaffected by something called the United States of America. And I'm talking to you, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters. You are at the core of this history I'm talking about. And so the great betrayal of the Treaty of Paris of 1783, the great betrayal is that the government of Britain gave all the land north of the Ohio River to this new polity, to the land speculators, to George Washington, to Benjamin Franklin. And that land, of course, had been promised by treaty, Fort Stanwix's treaty, as lands reserved to the Indians as their hunting ground. So the founding of the United States involved a major betrayal of the First Nations, and first and foremost, a betrayal of the Mohawks, because Joseph Brant and Molly Brant, who was, William Johnson's lover, and they had children, this was the heart and soul of the British alliance with First Nations against this newcomer, the people who had found something called the United States of America. And those individuals on the ground in North America, like, for instance, Haldeman himself, who I think was Prussian, those members of the British Imperial Indian Department, it was unbelievable how bitter was the response. In Indian country, you betrayed us. And suddenly you're telling us right in the heartland of the League, right in Onondaga, where the white pine of pieces, this is going to be something called New York State, governed by somebody else, and Great Britain is giving this approval and elevating this to the highest level of international politics at the time. So this is the context of the Haldeman, that, of course, Joseph Brant and the Mohawks and the people who gravitated around him could not accept this. And the British hadn't totally withdrawn from North America. They retained north of the Great Lakes. And so there was an anticipation. Of course, Joseph Brant and those who are connected to him are going to flee from this land of freedom and democracy. Well, a lot of people didn't believe that. They became the United Empire Loyalists. They became the part of Canada that is largely Protestant, that speaks English, that created a place called Ontario. And before there was an Ontario, there was an Upper Canada. And before there was an Upper Canada, there was the Mohawk Chapel. 1785. This is the history of I was born in Wellesley Hospital in Toronto. I'm an Ontario boy. My dad's from Ireland. My great-great-great-grandfather founded Fergus, Ontario, which is on the Grand River, in the Haldeman Trap. He, benefited from this betrayal of the Haldeman. But to understand what the Haldeman is, it's a small concession in light of this huge betrayal, this enormous cheating of First Nations, and many of whom had been allied with the British Empire in opposing these secessionists. And of course, nobody had been more strongly allied and identified with that defense of what remained of British North America than Joseph Brant, than Molly Brant, than the people who came north and founded this place which became known as Brantford. And so it's unbelievable that this is on me to speak of this. And I do speak about the treatment of Palestinians by the Israeli settler expansionist state right now, and the fact that genocide that you people have been experiencing since 1492 is now being subjected on the Palestinians. And I speak often on press television, which is out of Tehran, the Islamic Republic of Iran, which is demonized in the media. But I've been there, I've been on conferences there, and I speak twice a week, even now. I've done so at Bill Squires' home about the latest indignities and assaults and atrocities being imposed upon the indigenous peoples of that territory who are fleeing lands because they cannot live there. It's been wrecked, it's been destroyed, it's a horrible Holocaust happening right now. And so this is my ability to talk about these things. This is my understanding as I put in those books. The second of those books was definitely written largely coming out of the Fournier trial, where, my goodness, I need to know more about genocide. There were many subjects I needed to know about. Jules Seawee, who was Fournier's teacher. My goodness, Jules Seawee is an amazing, the founder of the League of Indian Nations of North America, who was outlawed and criminalized himself. So now I've been essentially criminalized. And as I told Bill, and I'll just wrap up now, I said, until I can feel the safety and security of Mohawk territory beneath my feet. And I'm making a stand right now. I'm speaking as clearly and honestly as I can about major subjects of history. And sometimes I speak in court, as I did in the Fournier matter or in the Pitawanakwood matter. And what happens in court makes a lot of difference. And so now the administration of my university, the University of Lethbridge, has taken my kneecaps off. And I can't go into court now. I'm suspended without pay. What kind of maniac must I be? Oh my goodness, where did he choose to go in this moment where, I'm being smeared all over the media? There's a few people in this room, this won't come as entire news, that there's some certain professor. This is an assault on the institution of tenure. And we can't have universities as decent places where there is some safety and security for people who've done their homework, who've paid their dues, who've got tenure, to meet in a very intimate, important place with young people who are just experimenting with their ideas and need to feel a degree of safety. I was pulled out of my classroom. My students in this term, who I was up to class 5, and suddenly they don't have the professor. And they took the course, they wanted to take this course, and suddenly, they're depending on, I get to the end of the 13 weeks, and I do the work, and then I get a grade, and then I graduate, or I go on to this program, or whatever they're going to do. They were betrayed in order to pull me out of the classroom. And so, thank you very much. Jim Windle, I am going to this week, this is where I'm going to make my stand. This is where I'm going to make my stand. There's media out there. There are people who've been smearing me and saying, he hates Jews, he's a Holocaust denier, he wants a genocide. What an insult. And the kind of thing that is put on me, it doesn't only ruin my professional life, my financial life, it could take my real life, because you associate a person with the phrase, kill all Jews, every last one, which was smeared on me. Do you think that I can just take it for granted, that I can move around and not fear that somebody is going to hear that, take that seriously? The smear is continuing. Look at the B'nai B'rith website. B'nai B'rith, its job is to advocate for the security of Israel. That's who's behind this. There's a crackdown happening all over to get voices who are capable of analysis and silence them and discredit them and get them out of the classroom, off press TV. Well, thank you for hosting this event. The Haldeman Tract, there's a lot to this story, a lot more than meets the eye. History and how we interpret history really does matter. And thank you for allowing me to share my view of the Haldeman Proclamation, the Haldeman Deed, the Haldeman Tract Recognition Lunch. Thank you.
I'm gonna ask Arlie or Burl and his boys to sing a song before are we ready, Fawn? We're gonna do one more song. Last week was a really busy week for me. I spent 3 days in Calgary with National Chief Phil Fontaine, former National Chief Phil Fontaine, and I were guest speakers on a national level. And I thank Dr. Tony Hall for his comments, because every time I'm introduced to speak somewhere or invited to speak, I ask, do you want me to just rouse the crowd, or do you want me to full-scale riot? Which one do you want? Because I can do both. And when I listened to Tony,